Hey y'all, welcome to Where is My Hairbrush? I'm Eliza,
And I'm Gabrielle.
and we're here to talk about VeggieTales.
That's right.
Now, many people may ask, why do this podcast? Where does it come from? And we have a few answers. The main one being we really like VeggieTales. It's a good project, you know. It's one of those things where some people who really believed in the power of the gospel and the Bible said, let's get together and let's make something that's, you know, easy to comprehend in the current world and make it kid friendly and awesome and pour a lot of effort into it, and maybe it'll be something really cool.
And then one
Like,
day Eliza called me and said, "Do you want to do a podcast about VeggieTales?" And I said, "Yes." And now we're
yes,
doing it.
and here we are. Welcome. Now, there's going to be a few segments to our show. We plan to do this continually. So, the first episode obviously is like the first pancake. It may have a few awkward places, but going forth, we'll have the same sort of layout so that you can come to expect certain things from the podcast.
So we'll start every episode with talking about what do we remember about the VeggieTales episode that we're discussing. Our plan is to cover a different episode each episode. And so we'll talk about what really stood out to us as a child, what actually happened in the episode. Do we remember it correctly? And then we're going to talk about how it compares to the actual Bible passage, if there is one. And then how has this episode or how has the Bible story impacted our lives as adults?
So, going back to the very beginning, back in the year 1993, there was the first episode, Where is God When I'm Scared? It was in two parts. The first part was The Tales from the CRISPR, boom, and then the second part was Daniel in the Lion's Den. Gabrielle, do you remember which silly song went with this episode? Did you remember before you watched to prep for this very important podcast?
I did, but I'm not going to remember every time. But I do remember this one only because Larry's voice is so different
Oh my gosh.
in the first episodes. And so this silly song where Larry's singing has Larry's like OG voice. And so that's why I know that it goes together. But
Okay.
that's the only reason. What
I
about you?
remembered this one for the same reason. I remembered him having like that awkward, like lower voice,
Yeah.
and that it didn't last for long. So I was
Mm,
thinking to myself, this has got to be the water buffalo episode. And indeed,
right.
it
I
is.
I don't even know how many episodes it lasted. I'm really interested to find out as we go along. If it was it just this episode or
Yeah,
were there
my gut says
extra?
one because I can't remember any other silly songs with Larry with the same voice timbre, you know?
I don't either. I
So
don't
I,
either. Yeah, that's funny. Okay, so what do you remember from this episode before you rewatched it? What were your highlights?
okay, the thing that most stuck in my brain that was really just burned into those little brain wrinkles
Hmm.
was the dance that the celery stalk boys do
Hmm.
in the Daniel part of the episode where they're like
Hmm.
dancing around in a circle, but it's like early CGI, so their bodies
Yes.
aren't moving very fluidly. It's very like jerking their hips around trying to do a
Yes.
celery dance.
Oh my gosh.
And I remember being very little in my socks on my parents' like that faux wood flooring that locks together that has a
Uh-huh.
very smooth top. I
Uh-huh.
remember being in my socks and I would get my like most fuzzy ones so that I could slip the most to try to do this dance exactly how the celery would do it.
That is awesome.
I'm sure it was terrible.
No, I'm sure it was great. I think all dancing done by small children is always adorable and amazing.
You can get by with a lot just being under 10, you know?
Yes, absolutely.
Sweet. What
That's
do
so
you
funny.
remember the most from this episode?
I remember something very different. I think the Daniel part of it was my favorite, like that half. However, the Franken celery section was very traumatizing to me.
Oh
But okay, I don't know if that's true. I just there's a moment when Junior is walking up the stairs in his house after watching this scary movie called Frankencelery, and he looks at a family portrait and they all turn into Frankensteins, like monsters.
no. Yes.
And when I was a child, and this is like a chicken and the egg situation. When I was a child, I went through a phase where I thought my family turned into monsters when I wasn't looking at them. And it wasn't like I thought they turned into Frankenceleries necessarily, but I was like afraid that they were not real humans and it was just me being a human with like scary people, but they only turned into humans when I could see them. And I don't know if I had that fear because of this episode or if this episode only like made my fear more real. I don't know, but that's probably my biggest memory for
If you
me.
could like work up the sort of strength inside to write a story like that or a book like that, I think it would sell. I think the sci-fi world would eat that up.
Oh, like where you were living with monsters?
Yes, but when you looked at them, they were humans.
Yeah.
I think that would, it goes between like psychological thriller and sci-fi, but I think it would
Yeah.
really, I think it would sell. A little money maker for later in life
Monetize
when
my
you.
childhood trauma.
That's what all true artists do. Awesome. Um, I think I think I did remember the songs stick in my head more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah. I
remembered that scene from the first half with Junior Asparagus when he's in his bed and the song
yes.
is happening and there were like the little
Yes.
ball monsters jumping into
Hopping up
his.
and down. They're like
Yes.
they look like tribbles from Star Trek, if you know what those look like, which were basically just pom poms because it was old Star Trek and they had no special effects.
Yeah, I mean, they look like bouncy balls with a
So
little
cute.
bit more gumption. Um,
Yes.
for some reason, those stuck in my head with like their little sound effects they made as they were bouncing.
Hmm.
These are the things
I
that,
was when I was listening to the episode or watching the episode yesterday, I was like making dinner and it really struck me how I know every single word to every single song, pretty
mm,
much without exception. They're in there very deep in my brain.
I think wrong lyrics get embedded in my brain from being a kid. Like, I'll be singing along with a song that I've
Mm-hmm.
known for a long time
Mm-hmm.
and it will be the wrong lyrics. And this is true of VeggieTales songs and just random, like, Motown songs,
Yeah.
anything, like just random text
Yeah.
in my head that I thought made sense that I've been singing since I was like 5. And then I'll say them out loud around another adult with a brain in their head, and they'll be like, why would the mashed potatoes be jumping against the walls? Like,
To be fair, that song has a lot of words.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
And also VeggieTales songs don't usually make a lot of sense depending on the song anyway. So you could probably get away with a lot of wrong words there.
That's true.
I have one more thing to share that I wrote down that I remembered before I watched the episode. I wrote down that the Frankenstein monsters actor comes into Junior's room and lets him know he's just a normal guy from Toledo. And I don't know if it's because I'm from not so far away from Toledo that I remember that so specifically, but then in my question marks I wrote Toledo question mark because I was like, am I just making that up? But I was right. He is from Toledo. So I remember that.
I'm so proud of you. Your random Ohio geography just really came through. It really buried into your brain. It's like a little brain worm just sitting in there.
Yep.
But, that knowledge could be, or that space could be used to store knowledge that's helpful.
Uh,
Like.
But instead, I remembered that the actor in this fake show is from Toledo. It's fine.
That's good.
Okay, so what happens in this episode? What is the overall plot? Do you want to talk about the first segment?
Yes, the junior asparagus tales from the crisper. Yeah, it's it's pretty typical. I mean, as someone who is a recovering scared of the dark person,
Mm,
this
aren't we
episode
all?
always set very deeply with me. Yeah, like
Yeah.
to the point when I was a child, I wouldn't do the chores that were outside once the sun had gone down because I
Aw.
couldn't make myself go outside because I was scared something was going to eat me or take me or
Yeah.
I don't know. Um,
I had a hard time with my basement. And like I had a
Basements,
finished basement. It wasn't a scary basement. I just didn't want to go down there if no one else was there and it was dark.
I understand. There's just something about the dark that's unknown, and our
Mhm.
little like pea brains are remembering the ancient of days when, you know, big animals would come and
Mm,
get us in the dark.
yeah.
But I remember this episode vividly, and then when I was rewatching it, most of it had stuck with me because
Hmm.
I rewatched this one a lot because it was applicable for me.
Hmm.
I've
Hmm.
also I think it's so funny and like relatable that Junior Asparagus was watching something a bit past his maturity level
Yes.
and then it totally wrecked his brain.
The whole time, and then he's like, it's not too scary. And then the just the whole time, every single thing he says, I teach elementary school, and every single thing that came out of his mouth, I was like, yep, that's exactly what a 5-year-old would say to an adult in this situation. They pegged him. It's great.
Having older sisters, I always wanted to be a little bit further ahead on the maturity level than I was.
Mm-hmm.
So I always wanted to watch the things that they were watching, which was fine for like Saved by the Bell, like
Right.
that's not going to give you nightmares. But it was tricky for things like, NCIS or
Yeah.
Alias or stuff where there was a lot of like gore or people getting hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Like often, I found myself in a
Right.
situation where I was struggling to sleep because I was seeing things that I'd seen on TV that were just sticking with me in a way that was not good for
Yeah.
my little health. So I really connected with Junior Asparagus on this episode. And I think I think it's a valid point. Like sometimes you don't know what's good for you and you have your parents to guide you a little bit and be like,
Yeah.
scary stuff is going to give you scary visions and
Right.
it's going to disturb your sleep and if you don't sleep you're going to be cranky and yada 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 yada.
Right.
Like I think that's a fair enough point. So that being said, this whole first half was spent like taking something that's a common childhood theme of like
Mm-hmm.
I want to watch what's cool or I want to do something that's cool
Or I
and
want to act bigger than I am or older than I am.
yes, and
Mm-hmm.
it fueling like fears of like the dark or monsters or whatever.
Yeah.
And then comes like the VeggieTales part where it's like,
Bob
hey,
and Larry just appear in his room. They
we're
evaporate, for lack of a better word, which scares Junior, I think, more than the Franken-celery did.
yes, but they come with help.
Yes.
And it was like the help was to remember that although there are monsters in the world even like or there are monsters on TV there like
Mm-hmm.
although there are scary things around that no matter what is ailing you or like scaring you, God is bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is super applicable as an adult too, right?
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
think I find people kind of scary, like not just in the way of like, sometimes people are kind of rough around the edges and
Right.
make you feel a certain way, but like if you have to go into a meeting to present something to someone you know is not necessarily the kindest to new ideas,
Yeah, that's really intimidating.
it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
But being able to even go back to that little childhood memory of God is bigger than that and those
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of priceless. It's a good little
Yeah.
reset. Um, it's it is also super similar to what my mom used to tell me when I was little. Like when I couldn't sleep and I was having trouble, I would like go into the den because they were still awake because it was like 7:30 at night.
Hmm.
And I'd be like, "Mom, I can't sleep," and she'd be like, "Just go to your bed and you pray this prayer over and over again. Devil, in the name of Jesus, you go away. I gotta go to sleep." And by golly, I would
You
lay
went
in
to sleep.
bed and I would pray that thing over and over again until eventually, it was the next morning and I was waking up. Yeah, like the mantra
Yeah.
aspect and the like, the prayerful aspect, that just
Yeah.
believing that God's gonna take care of you, even when you don't know how to take care of yourself, kind of thing, is
Yeah.
very powerful.
Something else I really like about this half is that when the Frankenstein celery actor shows up from Toledo, um, it's it. Hmm. I don't know what the right word is, but it makes Junior realize that some things that we're scared of aren't actually that scary. Like you need to sometimes look at things from a different angle and it becomes less intimidating. And I think that's a really good object lesson for everybody, not to let things scare you for no reason because we know God's bigger, but also sometimes you just need to look around and like see what the situation really is and realize that's like, oh, we're gonna be okay. This isn't that scary.
Mm.
Um,
Don't
I
miss
also
the
want to note, did you know that this happened in real life with the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz?
no. What do you mean? What?
Children were so afraid of the lady who played her. And it got to the point, I guess, where like she'd be out in public and children would scream
Oh
seeing her.
no.
And so Mr. Rogers had her on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and she came in her full costume and then he explained that she's just a nice lady pretending to be the Wicked Witch of the West. And so I read that story recently and I wonder if VeggieTales drew from that as inspiration for this moment in this episode.
I think it's definitely possible, but the thing with like big truths is that they're big truths for a reason. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty universal and like all children sort of experience fear. So
Yeah.
it's possible for sure, but it also could have been just genuine thought that sprung the Franken celery. I don't
Yeah.
know. That's a
Yeah.
good question.
So the second half of this episode is the story of Daniel. And basically, we start out with King Darius talking about how he had a scary dream and he wants someone to explain it to him. And nobody can except for Daniel. And so then Darius is like, Daniel, you're so awesome. Will you be my second in command? And Daniel's like, sure. And then comes the song that you were talking about, where all
Mm.
these other guys are like, what are we going to do? The king likes Daniel more than me and you.
We gotta get him out of here, but don't
I
bump him.
can't even paraphrase it because it's too ingrained. So they convince the king. They decide what they're going to do is to convince the king to make a law that says no praying or worshiping anybody except King Darius. And the king's like, "Cool, that sounds fine." And then they immediately run to Daniel's house because they know he prays every day. And Daniel prays, and then they're like, "Ha, gotcha!" And then they just throw him in the lion's den and say goodbye. And then everybody comes the next morning to see what had happened, and Daniel's still there. And it turns out he's just fine, and that the lions brought him pizza. I had forgotten about that part. I thought that was so funny. Even one of the wise men's like, "Where'd they get pizza?"
Which is so like, you know, like such good kid humor. Because you
Yes.
remember being in school and like certain classrooms would win a pizza party if they raised
Mm.
enough money or got enough test score. Like they did something.
Yeah.
They won some sort of
Yeah.
arbitrary competition. and they got a pizza party, and everyone else would be like, "Where'd they get pizza from?
Where
What's
they
that pizza
got
doing? Oh, do they have pepperoni?
pizza.
Oh my god!" Like,
It's so funny. I love it.
it's good. It's good
Yeah,
stuff.
so that's basically that's the whole thing. There's some really good songs in there, but it's pretty straightforward as far as like that part of the story. Do you have a favorite quote from either half of this episode?
My quote is probably Junior Asparagus saying, "Because I know whatever comes my way, that God can handle it."
That's a good one. Mine is from the same song, and it's when at the beginning of the song, and Bob's like, "Oh, and the little monsters you were talking about are hopping up and down, and they're going boing, boing, boing," and Bob's like, "What are you gonna do?" And Junior says, "I'm going to call the police." He really means it.
And he should have probably.
He should have. There's two strangers in his room. They came from the ceiling. It was a really good thought, Junior.
That's so funny. Oh my gosh. Um, I think on the whole, this episode, like the biblical part of it, like the Daniel
Mhm.
part, I think it stuck to the original story more than the typical VeggieTales episode does.
It really
Um,
did.
it varied some. They had some variants, but I think most of the variants that were made were for time's sake less or
Hmm.
more than they were for like um, making sure you don't horrify any children's sake. You know, like there wasn't much vegifying, quote unquote.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree. So if you wanted to read this Bible passage, it's Daniel 6. It's just one chapter. It's actually really short. I was pretty surprised at how short the story was in the Bible. Um, and the only big differences I noticed was that in the VeggieTales episode, they keep calling the three bad guys wise men. And in my translations, I read two different translations. One of them said administrators, and one of them called them presidents and governors. So
Mm.
I thought that was kind of interesting that they changed that word because you'd think a child would understand what a president is. I don't know, maybe it would just get too confusing because president for us means something very specific. But yeah, anyway, it was like wise men makes me think of like spiritual leaders, but saying administrators or governors is like a very political leader. You know what I mean?
In reality, I think they were probably both over like districts throughout the kingdom. I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, it kind of described it as like they had their own regions that they were in charge of or something like that.
Yes. So they like, you have the king and then you have like
Mm-hmm.
the second tier. These were like
Right.
the second tier boys. Um, and then Larry's character Daniel was
Mm-hmm.
made to be the most,
Above all of
yeah,
them.
like he was like
Mm-hmm.
a skosh above. You have
Yeah.
King at level 1, Daniel's at level 1.5,
Mm-hmm.
and then the rest of the
Everyone
wise men are
else.
level 2,
Yeah, yeah.
or the rest of the governors or the people overseeing the districts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one difference that I thought was interesting, and I think this was a time saver one more
Mm-hmm.
than anything. Daniel came to be in that position not because of Darius, but because of the king prior to him, King Belshazzar.
Yes.
Belshazzar, some
Belshazzar, I think, is, but either way.
yeah. Biblical name pronunciations not in my strong wheelhouse, as you will discover throughout the course of the show. But King Belshazzar had been living all kinds of crazy ways, and he was the king who saw the
Yes.
writing on the wall.
Right. Right. And
And then
Daniel translated that for him.
yes, and the translation said, "You've been acting the fool," basically, and your going to get overtaken by this competing society, the Medes.
Mm-hmm.
And turns out the guy was like, "Whoa, you're a genius," even though he was giving him bad news, which I think is shocking. Like,
Mm-hmm.
as a king, it is
Mm.
typical for kings to be like, "You're giving me bad news. I don't like it. Bye bye.
Off with
Bye
your
bye
head.
bye." You know, like,
Mm-hmm.
but he was given bad news, but he was really grateful for it, and gave Daniel this prestigious place, and then shortly
Because
died
Daniel
after
was a
that.
slave. I mean, Daniel, his people had been captured. Like he's not supposed to be here. He's not the same, like from the same country as these people. He's essentially a slave until that happens and he gets like this higher status. And I think that probably is the root of why the other administrators really didn't like him because they probably
Ooh.
felt he had no right to be above them because he's not even, they probably just felt he didn't deserve it.
Right. So they were like not just jealous, but also racist, is
Mm-hmm.
your guess. Probably true. Yeah, that's like typical of human nature, is to be
Mm-hmm.
horrible in that way. Um, yeah, so that's how he came to his place in the pecking order, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel came to be in that place. And then King Darius was the Mede that replaced King Belshazzar.
Right. Something else I thought was kind of cool when I was reading Daniel was Darius clearly really, really loved Daniel and valued him because when he realized that he had been tricked by signing this law, this kind of happens in the episode, but not as much. He's like extremely upset and he is trying to repeal the law. He tries to find a way out for Daniel not to be thrown in the lion's den. I mean, he's like trying everything. And it says that when he went home, he couldn't sleep. He didn't eat. He didn't want anyone to talk to him. He was like beside himself that this has happened to his friend, essentially. And I feel like in the veggie version, they kind of just made him seem a little bit stupid. Like, he was like, "Oh, well, okay, I guess." And like even when he comes back the next morning in the veggie version, he's like, "There's no hope that he's gone." And in the Bible passage, the next morning when they come to check, he is like the first one there. And he's like, "Daniel, are you okay?" Like he immediately is checking to see if he's okay.
Mm.
I think I did think Darius was kind of stupid because of the veggie episode.
I mean, the man did sign with the
It was,
king's
yeah,
seal, something
he
he
was duped.
clearly didn't really read. Like,
Yes.
how
He
dumb you
did
gotta
not
be?
read
Like,
the terms and conditions.
no. Um, it's like he bought into a pyramid scheme and is
Yeah.
just stuck there, like crazy. I think my favorite detail that was left out came shortly after that,
Mm-hmm.
that God closed the mouths of the
Mm-hmm.
lions when he
Mm-hmm.
was thrown into the den.
Yeah.
Um, like it was not just
Coincidence.
they didn't bite him, that
Mm-hmm.
they were just around. He
They
closed
also
their
didn't eat pizza.
mouths. They did not eat pizza. They were probably ravenous because they were living
Right.
in like a sort of enclosed area. And they
I mean, it was
probably
a
were.
lion's den for a reason. Intentionally didn't feed them so that they could throw people in there. So they were definitely hungry.
Mm-hmm.
In the Bible, when Daniel comes out of there unscathed, Darius throws those wise men straight into the lion's den and also their wives and children.
Mm-hmm.
So that got taken out of the veggie version. And it even says they were torn to shreds before they hit the ground. I was like, whoa.
Oh my gosh.
I did know that. And I kind of thought that they did get thrown in there in the veggie version. I don't know why I thought that because that clearly is violent.
Mm. It's the commingling of reality and
Yep.
veggiality that just
Yeah. It's
really
hard to separate. I'm
it
already
is
learning that
hard.
it's really hard to know the difference.
Yeah. Um,
Mhm.
but it did a good job for the most
They
part.
did a
And
great job.
I think you
What?
probably want to vegify the ending a little bit
Yes.
because,
No, that was wise. I would have been scared otherwise.
yeah,
Um, well, my favorite detail from the story that's in both versions is that after this incident, Darius decrees that the God of Daniel is the true God and that he is to be feared and revered. And he is essentially converted, and I think in this moment where he very much believes in God, and he even tells Daniel before he goes in to the lion's den in the Bible passage, only your God can save you. I can't save you. I hope that you pray and that you'll get saved because there's no other way. So it's really cool that he even turns, I think, a 180 and makes a law that says you can only pray to this God because he saw how true it was.
it's also really speaking to the times of
Mm-hmm.
like everyone has a god that they're praying to because there's so much out of their hands in those days. Or like they're still living
Mm-hmm.
in the times where if it doesn't rain, people don't eat,
Right.
which
Right.
is true now.
It's just not as extravagant.
Oh, yeah, we have so much technology,
Yeah.
and the ability to get food from places that have had rain,
Mm-hmm.
that like it's just not as present in our brains as it once
Right.
was. And so everyone is praying to somebody that the crops will get watered and
Mm-hmm.
that the animals will be fed so that you can eat in the winter, like
Mm-hmm.
so that
Mm-hmm.
you are able to survive.
Or there won't be a terrible storm, or it won't
Mm,
get flooded, or whatever.
hmm. Yeah. There's just a lot less control. And so Darius is not just saying that. I mean, he's saying it because Daniel is religious, obviously. That's why he's getting thrown in the den. But
Mm-hmm.
also, he's saying that probably because everyone has someone they appeal to in
Mm-hmm.
times of dire stress. Um,
Well, and he wants a good God on his country's side. I mean, he's the ruler. He probably wants, if he believes that this God could do something, like, why not tell everybody to pray to him?
yeah, for sure. Which brings me to our final segment of the episode,
Yes.
which is how has this episode affected your adult life? Either as like a story of a time
Mm-hmm.
that's come to you, or like how a concept from it has stuck with you. Um, and speaking of
Mm-hmm.
God being there for you in dire times, um, when I lived in New Zealand, one of the jobs I worked was being like a group leader slash mediator for a Bible study that was mostly Korean mothers that had moved from South Korea with their children, and their
Mm-hmm.
husbands were still in South Korea. So
Yeah.
they were in this new country. Their children were at school all day. And it was a very isolating experience for them because usually their English was developing, but not in like, not super
Yeah.
advanced.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't like making friends at school like their kids were. So this was like community group time for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they all had a lot of fears of like, what if because some of them moved when their kids were in high school, like they're like, what if my kids don't catch up in time? What
Right.
if they don't make any friends and they'd hate it here? What if, like,
Right.
what, heaven forbid, what if my husband is like, not being faithful back in South Korea?
Right.
Like
Really,
all,
really big life things and a whole
yes,
lot of them.
huge things. And they had so much time to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the weeks we were talking about fear in general, and like a little section in the back of my brain remembered the God is bigger than the boogeyman song.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, guys, do you mind if I play you a song? And they were like, oh, sure. I pulled this up on my phone, we're like all gathered around it. I have the
And I'm sure
volume
they were
all the way
not
up.
expecting this song of
No,
all the songs.
absolutely not. And it starts playing, and at the end, they all understood what it meant because yeah, it's on kids level, right? So like
Right.
the words easy to understand, very repetitious, and they were like, you know, this makes
Yeah.
sense. Thank you for that. Which is crazy. Like, why would a random children's song from 1993 have any sort of impact in like 2019 for a bunch of 40 and 50-year-old Korean women? Like,
Right.
why? But it does, you know, like
Yeah.
it's the mysterious ways of the spirit, you know, like it's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
really cool.
Absolutely. Well, and like you said at the beginning, the people who made VeggieTales poured so much time and talent and thought and intention into every part of it. It's even when Eliza and I were recording the music for the intro and the outro, I texted her and I was like, I have never listened to it this closely. Why is it so hard? Like it's all really high quality, even though it's so silly. But they were really trying to be so intentional. And so even in the silliness of these songs and the animation and the voices and that it's talking vegetables, there's so much truth behind all of it. And I think that's why it continues to be relevant and why even as we grew up, because I knew I watched VeggieTales, I mean,
Mm,
always. I mean,
every day,
did I ever stop?
every
Um,
day.
but I kept watching because it continues to be true and it's yes, it's fun, but you're never too old to have somebody tell you God is bigger than the boogeyman. Like God is bigger than whatever problem you happen to be facing at the time. It doesn't matter what the problem is. And sometimes it helps to be reminded of that in a really simple way.
Big true.
Thanks for sharing that story with us. That's so cool.
Tell me your story. How has it affected your adult life?
Well, I definitely have sang the God is bigger than the boogeyman song to myself many times. I don't have a specific time like you do, but I also was really always comforted by that song in the episode that is sung when Daniel is in the lion's den. And it says, "Fear not, Daniel, don't cry, Daniel, don't you know you're not alone?" And and it's really pretty and it's kind of ethereal and it's like an angel is singing to him. And I do remember all like that song would also play in my head when I was feeling alone. And I think I'm making this connection just now about how often fear is accompanied by loneliness or vice versa. Like, usually, a lot of the time, we feel afraid because we're also feeling alone. And so I think it's really cool that this episode addresses both of those things. Like in the first half, Junior is is alone, but he's more just afraid because it was scary. And then Daniel's situation, I mean, was it all happened because he was alone. He was really one of the only people practicing his religion. He was alone when he was punished, all of these things.
Mm,
So I think it's cool that both were addressed. And I think that combination was always really comforting. And a reason why I've come back to this episode many times throughout my adult life, even because it's a good reminder.
yeah, it's it breathes, you know, like it's one of those things that it tells timeless truths, you
Mm-hmm.
know, as Bible stories often do. You know, it's why it's a document or a book that people read in
Mm-hmm.
childhood, adulthood, and you read it over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one of those things where like you read it and put it away forever. Like you read
Right.
the same stuff over and over again because it speaks in different ways at different points, depending
And
on
there's
where you sit.
always something new to be learned from what you're reading in the Bible. And I would argue in some ways there's something new to be learned from a lot of these episodes because you don't pick up on the same things when you're a kid as you do when you're an adult.
True.
Um, And when you're watching as an adult, you're like, wow, that's so true. And as a kid, you don't maybe know it's true yet because you're just a kid. You're
You're
just
more
being
like, why
taught.
is Archibald attacking Larry right now?
Right. Why are those lions eating pizza? These are the things we think about while we're a kid and why we're so engaged by it. But I mean,
Where's my water buffalo, you know?
yeah, why don't I have a water buffalo? Exactly. Yeah, but it's so engaging that you always stick through it and you end up learning really important things along the way.
Mm, for sure. Well,
Well,
guys, this has been episode 1. I hope you've
thank
enjoyed it. Thanks for
Yeah, thanks
joining
for
us.
being here. If you would like to tell us your favorite memory from Where's God When I'm Scared, you can email us at whereismyhairbrushpodcast@gmail.com. And we would love to hear your thoughts on how this episode has impacted your life.
Yeah, very much.
So until next time, everyone, remember, God made you special.
And he loves you very much. Bye, guys.
Bye.